April 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final chaotic weeks. A small group of exhausted German soldiers, now prisoners of war, were being escorted westward by Canadian infantry. They had surrendered without resistance after days of retreat through forests and shattered towns. They expected anger. They expected revenge. They expected humiliation. Instead, the Canadian Guards were quiet, professional, almost calm. The prisoners whispered among themselves in low German. "Where are they taking us? Are we crossing the Rhine? Is this still German territory?" No one answered. The road curved through farmland, untouched fields, grazing cattle, wooden barns that looked strangely undamaged by war. It didn't feel like the broken landscape they had marched through days earlier. Then they reached the village. It looked normal. Children were walking between houses. Women were hanging laundry. A baker stood in the doorway of a small shop. The prisoners blinked. One of them muttered, confused, "Why is this place intact?" The Canadians halted the column in the center square. And that's when it happened. An elderly woman stepped forward. She looked directly at the prisoners and spoke, in flawless German. "Guten Tag. You must be tired." The prisoners froze. Every head snapped up. Another villager joined her, then another, all speaking perfect German, not broken phrases, not accents, native fluency. The prisoners stared at each other in disbelief. One whispered, "Are we still in Germany?" A Canadian sergeant overheard the comment and allowed himself the faintest smile. Because they were not in Germany. They hadn't been for miles. And what the prisoners were about to learn would challenge everything they thought they knew about the people on the other side of the war. The square grew silent. The prisoners stood rigid, their boots still dusty from days of retreat. The village felt wrong. Too peaceful, too untouched. No artillery scars, no shattered windows, no smoke on the horizon. And yet, everyone was speaking German. One of the younger POWs finally spoke aloud. "Wo sind wir?" "Where are we?" The elderly woman answered calmly. "You are in Canada." The words didn't register. A few of the prisoners actually gave short, confused laughs. One shook his head. "That's impossible." The Canadian sergeant stepped forward. Not aggressive, not mocking, just steady. "You were transported 3 days ago. Train, then trucks." The realization hit slowly, like cold water. They remembered the rail cars, the darkness, the long stretch of motion. But they had assumed it was just relocation within Europe. Canada? Across the ocean? One prisoner whispered, "They brought us home?" But this wasn't home. The village looked German because it was built by immigrants decades earlier. Families who had left Europe long before the war. Farmers, bakers, craftsmen. They kept the language, the traditions, the architecture, but they were Canadian citizens, and now they stood face to face with men who had been fighting against their new homeland. A young Canadian villager stepped forward, speaking clear, measured German. "We came here for peace, not war." There was no anger in his voice. That unsettled the prisoners more than anything. They had expected hostility. Instead, they were being offered water, bread, blankets. One POW looked at the children staring at them from behind a fence. "They don't look afraid." The Canadian Guard answered quietly. "They've seen enough newsreels. They know the war is ending." A long pause settled over the square. For the first time since surrendering, the prisoners felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not humiliation, but confusion, because the people speaking their language were not their people anymore, and the war they thought they understood suddenly felt much larger and much smaller at the same time. One of the older prisoners looked up at the wooden sign hanging near the town hall. "Herzlich willkommen." Welcome. He swallowed hard. "We lost more than territory." No one answered. The Canadians motioned for the column to move again, but the prisoners walked differently now, slower, quieter, thinking. The column moved again, not toward barbed wire, not toward shouting guards, but toward something that looked disturbingly ordinary. A school building, white walls, clean windows, a Canadian flag moving slowly in the wind. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. "This is a camp?" The Canadian sergeant answered simply, "For now." They were led inside the yard. No watchtowers looming overhead, no searchlights, just fencing. Practical, controlled, but not oppressive. Tables had been set up. Medical personnel waited. One of the prisoners muttered, "This is propaganda." Another replied quietly, "No, this is something else." They were instructed to sit. Names recorded, ranks noted, wounds examined. A Canadian medic cleaned a deep cut on one soldier's forehead. The soldier flinched, not from pain, but from disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" he asked in German. The medic answered in the same language, "Because you're not fighting anymore." Silence. That sentence carried more weight than any weapon. Outside the yard, villagers watched from a distance, not celebrating, not jeering, just observing, with curiosity and caution. One older Canadian man stepped closer to the fence. His German accent was heavier, older. "I left Europe in 1912, he said quietly. "Never thought I'd hear this much German again." One of the prisoners looked up at him. "Do you still consider yourself German?" The man paused, then answered carefully, "I consider myself Canadian." The distinction landed hard. For years, these prisoners had been told a story about loyalty, identity, borders, belonging. But here stood people who spoke their language, remembered their traditions, and chose a different nation. A younger POW whispered to his friend, "If they can leave, maybe we could have too." No one responded, because that thought was dangerous. The Canadian officer stepped forward again. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said firmly. "You will work, you will eat, you will return home when the war ends." One prisoner looked toward the peaceful farmland beyond the fence. "And if there is nothing left to return to?" The officer didn't answer, because everyone in that yard knew Europe was in ruins. And for the first time the prisoners felt something heavier than defeat. Uncertainty. Not about who had won the war, but about what came after it. And that question would follow them long after they left this village. The first night passed without incident. No shouting, no interrogations, no threats in the dark. The prisoners lay on simple cots inside the converted school building. Clean blankets, dim electric lights, the smell of wood and soap, not smoke and mud. One of the younger soldiers couldn't sleep. "This isn't right," he whispered. "Why aren't they treating us like enemies?" Across the room, an older sergeant answered quietly, "Because the war is almost over." Morning came gently, not with alarms, but with sunlight pouring through classroom windows. Outside, the prisoners were escorted to work details, not forced labor, but structured routine, clearing brush, repairing fencing, helping move supplies. They were supervised, yes, but not humiliated. At midday, something happened that unsettled them more than anything else so far. They were served lunch at long wooden tables. Soup, bread, coffee, and Canadian guards sat at the same tables. One prisoner stared at the guard across from him. "You trust us enough to sit here?" The guard shrugged. "You're unarmed." It wasn't arrogance. It was matter of fact. Later that afternoon, a small group of village children approached the outer fence. Curious, hesitant. One boy held a worn leather football. He called out in German, "Did you really come from Europe?" A prisoner nodded slowly. "Yes?" The boy looked amazed. "Is it true the cities are gone?" No one answered immediately. Finally, one prisoner spoke. "Yes." The children fell quiet. For the first time, the prisoners were not being asked about strategy, or loyalty, or politics. They were being asked about reality. That evening, an elderly woman, the same one who had first spoken in the square, returned with a small basket of bread. She addressed the prisoners calmly. "You are far from home. but you are alive. That matters." One prisoner looked down at the ground. Alive. In the last months of the war, that word had felt rare. As days passed, something shifted. The tension didn't disappear, but it changed shape. The prisoners began to realize something unsettling. The Canadians did not need to prove their strength. They simply lived it. Order without cruelty. Confidence without rage. And that quiet stability forced the prisoners to confront something they had avoided for years. If this was the enemy, then what had they really been fighting? One evening, as the sun set over peaceful farmland, a prisoner turned to another and whispered, "When we go back, nothing will feel the same." His friend didn't argue, because deep down they both knew the war had already changed them, and they were still thousands of miles from whatever future awaited them. A week passed. Routine settled in. Morning roll call, work details, meals at long tables, evenings under a quiet sky that held no searchlights. For the first time in years, the prisoners were not waiting for artillery, and that silence began to feel heavier than explosions. One afternoon, a Canadian officer gathered the group. "There has been news," he said calmly. Berlin was encircled. The front lines were collapsing. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. The prisoners stood motionless. No cheering, no visible reaction, but something shifted in their eyes. One of them asked quietly, "What will happen to us?" "You remain here," the officer replied, "until formal surrender and processing are complete. And then, you go home." The word home no longer sounded simple. That evening, the prisoners sat longer than usual outside the barracks. No one rushed inside. One younger soldier finally spoke what others had been thinking. What if there is no home? No one dismissed the question. They had seen the bombed cities, the endless columns of refugees. The bridges collapsed into rivers. They had left Europe in chaos. Now they sat in a peaceful Canadian village where farms were intact and children still played football. The contrast was almost unbearable. Later that night, one of the prisoners approached the fence alone. On the other side stood the older Canadian man who had emigrated decades earlier. "You said you left in 1912, the prisoner began. "Yes." "Did you ever regret it?" The old man looked across the fields before answering. "I missed what I left behind, but I never regretted choosing something different." The prisoner swallowed. "Do you think we could choose something different too?" The question hung in the cool evening air. The old man didn't give advice. He simply said, "The war is ending. What you do after it, that's yours." For the first time, the prisoners were not thinking about strategy or survival. They were thinking about rebuilding, about accountability, about what kind of men they would be once the uniforms came off. Inside the barracks, one soldier quietly removed his insignia and placed it beside his bed. No ceremony, no speech, just a small, private decision. The next morning, work resumed, but something had changed. The prisoners were no longer just waiting to return to the past. They were beginning, slowly, uncertainly, to imagine a future, and that possibility frightened them more than the war ever had. It happened quietly. No sirens, no explosions, no gunfire echoing in the distance. Just a radio. On a gray morning in early May 1945, the Canadian officer gathered the prisoners again in the yard. The villagers stood farther back this time, as if they understood something historic was unfolding. The officer removed his cap. "The German High Command has signed an unconditional surrender." The words carried no triumph in his voice, only formality. "For you," he continued, "the war is over." No one moved. Some of the prisoners had expected this moment for weeks. Others had feared it. But now that it was real, it felt strangely hollow. One of the younger soldiers slowly sat down on a wooden crate. "That's it?" he asked quietly. "That's it," the officer replied. But it wasn't it, because surrender ended fighting. It did not end consequences. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere in the village shifted. Canadian families gathered near the church. Bells rang, not wildly, but steadily. Children waved small Canadian flags. The prisoners watched from behind the fence. They weren't mocked. They weren't taunted. They were simply separated from the celebration. One prisoner leaned against the fence and stared at the open farmland beyond. "I thought I would feel anger," he said. Another answered, "I thought I would feel relief." Instead, what they felt was weight. The weight of defeat. The weight of years spent believing something that had now collapsed completely. That evening, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman who had first spoken to them weeks earlier approached the fence again. This time, she brought a folded newspaper. She handed it through to the Canadian guard, who passed it to the prisoners. The headline confirmed it: "Surrender." Below it were photographs of ruined cities. One prisoner stared at an image of Berlin reduced to rubble. "My family," he whispered. No one had answers. For the first time, the Canadian officer stepped closer than usual. "You will be processed," he said calmly. "You will remain here for now. You will have the opportunity to write letters." That simple statement broke something inside several of them. Letters, contact, proof of survival. One prisoner turned to the officer. "Why are you telling us this yourself?" The officer paused before answering. "Because wars end, but men have to live afterward." That night, the barracks were silent. Not tense, not fearful, just quiet in a way none of them had experienced in years. Some stared at the ceiling. Some held the newspaper. One folded it carefully and placed it under his pillow. Outside, the Canadian village celebrated modestly. Church bells, distant laughter, the hum of life continuing. Inside the fence, the prisoners confronted something far more difficult than battle: responsibility. And tomorrow would begin a new chapter none of them had trained for. The celebration in the village faded within a few days. Life returned to routine: farming, church on Sunday, children racing down dirt roads. Inside the fence, however, a different kind of battle began. Tables were placed in the former classroom. Ink bottles, paper, envelopes stamped with Canadian military markings. The officer addressed the prisoners calmly. "You may write to your families. The letters will be inspected. No military details." That was all, but for the prisoners it felt overwhelming. For months, for some years, they had lived moment to moment. Survival first, everything else second. Now they were being asked to do something far more difficult: explain. One man sat frozen, pen hovering over paper. "What do you write after surrender?" Another began immediately. "I am alive," he wrote, then stopped. Alive felt too small a word. Across the room, a former sergeant wrote slowly, deliberately. "The war is over. I am in Canada. I am treated correctly." He paused before continuing. "I do not know what remains at home." That sentence stayed unfinished. Outside, through the classroom window, Canadian children were visible, playing near the fence again. The same boy with the leather football waved awkwardly. A prisoner lifted his hand in response. The fence still stood, but it felt thinner somehow. Later that afternoon, the elderly immigrant, the man who had left Europe decades earlier, was granted permission to speak briefly with a small group of prisoners under supervision. He brought no speeches, just stories. "I arrived here with nothing," he told them. "No money, no land, just hope that I would not have to fight again." One prisoner asked quietly, "Did people accept you?" The old man smiled faintly. "Not at first." Silence. Then he added, "But time changes things, if you let it." That evening, one of the prisoners tore up his first draft of a letter. It had been full of excuses. He started over. This time the words were different. "I was wrong about many things." No grand declarations, just honesty. Days turned into weeks. Some prisoners began helping voluntarily with more tasks, repairing farm tools, assisting with harvest preparation under guard supervision. Not because they were forced, because doing something constructive felt better than waiting. One Canadian guard observed quietly to another, "They're not the same men who arrived." "No," the other replied, "they're not," and neither were the villagers, because proximity changes perception. The villagers had expected hardened enemies. Instead, they saw tired young men writing letters home. The prisoners had expected cruelty. Instead, they experienced restraint. Neither side forgot the war, but both began to understand something more complicated than victory or defeat. One evening, as the sun dropped low over endless fields, a prisoner folded his finished letter carefully and sealed it. He looked toward the village lights in the distance. "For the first time," he whispered to himself, "I don't feel like a soldier." He didn't yet know what he felt instead, and that uncertainty would shape everything that followed. Summer arrived slowly. The Canadian fields turned deep green. Crops rose high in neat rows. The air smelled of soil and sunlight instead of smoke. Inside the camp, time began to stretch. The war was over, but the prisoners were still there, not as enemies, not yet as free men, something in between. Each week, lists were posted, names of prisoners scheduled for transfer, processing, repatriation. Men would gather around the board quietly, scanning for familiar surnames. Sometimes there were cheers, sometimes silence. One morning, a prisoner named Keller found his name on the list. He didn't celebrate. He stared at it for a long time. "Are you glad?" another asked. Keller hesitated. "I don't know what I'm going back to." That was the unspoken truth for many of them. Letters had begun to arrive from Europe, delayed, fragmented, censored by circumstance more than by authority. One man learned his house was gone. Another learned his younger brother had never returned from the Eastern Front. One received no response at all, and silence was the worst message of all. Meanwhile, the villagers continued their lives. The same boy with the football now spoke casually through the fence. He had learned some English phrases from the guards. A prisoner corrected his German grammar one afternoon. They both laughed. The sound startled them. Laughter had once belonged to another life. One evening, the Canadian officer approached a small group of prisoners sitting near the fence. "Some of you may return within months," he said. "Some may wait longer. Transportation takes time." One prisoner asked carefully, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if the war had gone differently?" The officer didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he finally said. "That's why I'm glad it didn't." No triumph in his voice, just relief. Days passed with quiet routine. Work in the fields under supervision became almost normal. Some villagers even requested specific prisoners to assist with skilled repairs: carpentry, mechanics, masonry. The trust was cautious, but it existed. One afternoon, during a supervised work detail, a prisoner stood on a small hill overlooking the farmland. He watched Canadian families working together, children running between rows of crops, a tractor moving steadily across the horizon. He turned to the guard beside him. "Did you always know this place would survive?" The guard shook his head. "No one ever knows that." The prisoner nodded slowly. For years, he had believed history moved in only one direction, through force. Now he was watching proof that endurance sometimes looked like patience instead. That night, back in the barracks, a different conversation began. "What if we return?" one man asked quietly, "and rebuild something better?" Another responded, "Will anyone listen to us?" Silence followed, because they all understood something difficult. Coming home would not make them heroes. It would make them reminders. Outside, the summer sky over Canada remained wide and peaceful. Inside the fence, men who had once marched across Europe now waited for ships, waiting for papers, waiting for answers, waiting for a version of themselves that had not yet been defined. And in that waiting, something subtle continued to change.